So I'd like to kick things off. I would just present very briefly kind of a quick set of ideas about how this fits into the broader scheme of what I've been working on for a little while now, which is this whole notion of seeing around corners and how can we be more, how can we think more broadly, be more mindful of the possibilities that face us when we're in these really unprecedented moments. So I'll start off with this idea of an inflection point. And those of you whom I work know that an inflection point is something that exerts a 10x force on your business. It changes your assumptions in some radical way. And I think it's really important to remember that when you're in the midst of an inflection point, you don't get to go steady state. You don't. It changes things. So you're either going to benefit from it and really succeed, or it's going to take your business into some kind of decline, or it's a combination of the two. So Ron and I were just talking to a potential client the other day, and this is a company that has absolutely thrived throughout the pandemic. And as the pandemic begins to look as though it's coming to a logical conclusion, they're kind of scratching their heads and saying, okay, how are we adding value, once the products that we offer are no longer in such high demand? Anybody who's in paint and lumber and, all the supplies for spare rooms, those businesses are going to be facing a very different environment than they had faced. So I think the core thing to remember about inflection points is you don't get the option of staying where you are. They're either going to take you up or they're going to take you in a different direction. And that's really what we wanted to talk about today, which is how do we think strategically as we move through this of what's going to be different. So the first principle for really thinking differently about the future is looking at the concept of what kind of indicators are we paying attention to as we think about what's coming. And the first big observation I would make is that there are three kinds of indicators. Lagging indicators, great information about stuff that's already happened. You can't change a lagging indicator. And unfortunately, for a lot of organizations, they're fixated on lagging indicators. So things like, how did we do this quarter is a question that comes up sometimes. Well, as anybody who's in a forward-looking company will tell you, the results we got this quarter were baked, maybe 2 years, even 3 years ago. So it's a lagging indicator. It's not a bad thing to measure. It's just that it's not going to help you when you look at the future. Then we have current indicators, and those are useful, right? Things like employee engagement. How hard is it to hire people? Where do we think we need to be investing in better net promoter scores? Those kind of things. They kind of tell you where you are. It's like the speedometer in your car. How fast are you going? The hardest thing to get a hold of are leading indicators. And that's what I really want to focus our conversation today on, which is what are the plausible things we want to have in our minds strategically as we think about where we're headed. And this brings me to the early warnings model. I talk about it in the book, Seeing Around Corners, but it's this reality we all have to deal with as strategists, is that the changes that are going to be super important for us begin as very weak signals, right? The strength of the signal is not that strong. And then slowly, then they start picking up steam, right? So you get this sort of gradually and then suddenly phenomenon. And then finally, when you get to what I call time zero, the inflection point is upon us. We know what it means. We've got facts, right? We understand what's happening now. The trouble is if you wait till then to make a strategic choice, it's late. It's too late because in strategy, you've always got another line. The degree of strategic freedom that you have is inversely related to the strength of the signals that you have to work with. It's one of the fundamental frustrations of being a strategist, right? By the time you know what the right answer is, it's too late. And so our challenge when we're dealing with this kind of dynamic is how do we move our decision processes back from time zero to what I call the period of optimal warning, which is that period in the middle where you've got enough confidence in the signals that you can start to make sense of them. But it's not so late that everybody else has figured it out as well, and there's no strategic advantage to be gained. So how do we do this? So a very practical way to do this is we posit some time zero events that we want to be thinking about, plausible events that could happen in the future that we want to be monitoring. And then we work backward in time from those events and ask the question, for that to happen, what would have to be true? What would have to be in the case? And I think it's a very interesting moment to be thinking about these time zero events. Now, a couple of notes on early warnings. Do not confuse your preferences with predictions. And this, I think, is something we all fall into. We would like a certain future to evolve. So that's the one we plan for. And that's the one we think about. And that's the one we embrace. Unfortunately, as Gary Hamel's very fond of saying, the future is remarkably indifferent to your preferences. So you really need to be opening your mind to what happens if, this doesn't happen. What's our plan B? Is our strategy robust to multiple possible futures? And we've seen an awful lot of corporate disasters where this wasn't the case. And, a very commonly known one is General Electric, which essentially doubled down a huge bet on the fossil fuel scenario being dominant for energy in a world where the price of renewables was dropping like a rock. And they locked themselves into a fixed asset future, and that's not what happened. In fact, it was only one of several possible futures that they could have been planning for. So you want to watch out for that. So here, what we're thinking about is a couple of time zero events that are potentially really important. So let's not just focus on the events we prefer. Let's also recognize that the benefit of a leading indicator is not necessarily whether what it predicted came true. In fact, some of the most powerful leading indicators I've ever seen are those where it was so profound and so strong that the thing it predicted never happened because we prepared. So what a leading indicator is there for is mental and organizational preparedness about a future time zero event. So here we are. It is June of 2021. And we're getting ready to get back out there, right? New York and California have just announced no restrictions. We're opening up. The city's jammed. You can't get a restaurant reservation in New York for love or money. People are out in the streets. People are talking about reviving live performances. Theaters are playing to packed audiences. And as far as a lot of people are concerned, we're done. That chapter is over. We're going to go live our lives. And the question you have to ask yourself is, okay, that's a preference. Let's go do that. But in terms of time zero events, let's think about 9 months from now. 9 months from now. So I want you to think forward to March of 2022, which is about 2 years after the world shut down. And I'm going to take two time zero events. Time zero event number one is masks off. No problem. The newspaper headline that would go like that is March 15th, in a fantastic combination of public health moves, availability of vaccines, the triumph of science, the world reopened safely. That might be the headline, right? There is a future I would not prefer, which is masks off, big problem. And what that time zero looks like is, pockets of recurrence, pockets of spikes. You pin your annual year on a conference that you're planning in Cincinnati, and 2 weeks before the conference, you have an outbreak. What do you do? And so, I think we need to be thinking about what are the early warnings we want to be paying attention to, because certainly over the globe, the pandemic has not left us. In fact, there have been more deaths so far in 2021 globally than there were in all of 2020. So my question for those participating and for Ron to kick off the discussion is, how robust are our strategies in each of those time zero scenarios? And what are the early warnings we might encourage people to be looking for? So before we turn it over to conversation, I just wanted to also say we have resources for you. So Ron and I are working in an organization called Valise, which I founded a few years ago, to go from, great thoughts and ideas to really tools and taking action and being willing to move forward, with practical things that you can use to bring strategy under uncertainty, to make innovation mastery graspable, and so forth. So when I wrote Discovery Driven Growth together with Ian McMillan, we invented a thing called the bare bones net present value calculator. And that's essentially a pretty fancy spreadsheet that allows you to use 9 input variables to basically measure or estimate the value of a project. And it's very useful for people in working in organizations for whom everything has to be accompanied by a spreadsheet. So if you're interested, you can go to the Valise.com website, click on the resources tab. You can download it for free, play around with it. And the great thing about that is if you're having the kind of conversation where somebody says, well, I don't think your advantage is going to last that long, you're like, fine, put in your numbers and let's see what happens. It can be a great way to get some clarity around what are the assumptions we're actually making. We also have a lot of articles. We've got videos which go on the Valise.com deeper dive, as well as a LinkedIn newsletter that I have, and Ron also posts quite often on LinkedIn. We publish articles. They come out every Tuesday. You can subscribe on LinkedIn. I have a monthly newsletter that I publish. You can also find both of us on Twitter, on YouTube, and Fireside Chats, which is what we're doing today, although this is a little bit different format. So that's us. You can find us at valise.com. And with that, I will stop sharing, turn it over to chat, and let's see what people want to talk about.
So Rita, just a comment. Frank has asked the question of a concrete example of kind of early warnings model. The example that we've put out here is that there's some point in the future, call it March of next year, that you have two alternative futures and that you can prepare for. One of our favorite examples, which we've been talking about lately, is the petroleum industry, right? So I think that's a great example, Frank, of there's an industry where you're looking down a tunnel, there's a light, and the light's not the end of the tunnel, it's a train coming, right? And the world is gonna change. And if you are Exxon, and you've seen what happened with Exxon over the last several months with, now I think it's 3 dissident board members joining the board, or you're in the petrochemical business and you're using petrochemicals to make your product, the world's going to change. Pricing's going to change. The demand for your product is going to change. So it's a fascinating study, because if you look at, I think oil's around $70 a barrel today, which is a 2-year high. The short term is completely disconnected with the long term. The long term is very, very clear that something's going to happen. It's very clear if you have, billions or hundreds of billions, as ExxonMobil has or BP has, that you have to do something very serious to prepare for this change.
Yeah, I would just add that the way I normally set it up, Frank, is we'll have a time zero event. And in the book, it goes into some depth about how you can generate those, which is essentially you take 2 uncertainties that are real. This gives you a 2x2 of 4 possible futures. And then you write a headline from each future. That becomes your time zero event. And then what we recommend is work backward and say, before time zero could happen, what would have to be true? Right. So let's take our time zeros that we're playing around with today. So March of 2022, no problem. What would have to be true? Right. We'd have to see increasing evidence that people are vaccinated or have somehow achieved some kind of immunity. We'd have to see that there aren't variants that are increasingly contagious. We'd have to see that good regimes in terms of keeping people safe continue to be adopted. We'd have to see, for example, that children are starting to be protected, and right. For that to be true, there's a lot that would have to happen before we believe in that scenario. And the same with the other scenario. In the other scenario, unfortunately, what you'll see is more deadly variants. You'd see people who are unable to, or unwilling to, or just can't get vaccinated for whatever reason, continue to be a large proportion of the population. You'll sort of see localized outbreaks, especially among more vulnerable populations. And the thing about global health is, if any of us are affected, all of us are at risk of being affected. So I think that's just really important to remember. So the worked model would be you have your time zero, and then you work backward looking for indicators. And then a best practice, what we advise our clients is, then you set up a little, almost call it a council within your organization, where everybody has a job. Everybody's looking after an indicator. So let's say Flaminia is looking after the indicator of, per local region, how many people, what percentage of the people are actually vaccinated. And she would track that, right? And now if Ron or I or you come across something that is evidence around that, now we know who to send it to, right? So we send it to Flaminia. Then we have our little meeting, maybe once every month, once every 2 months. And the purpose of the meeting is not to make decisions. The purpose of the meeting is to make sense of what's going on. So a very similar process to the one that Stan McChrystal used in his fabulous book, Team of Teams, when he was trying to mount a response by a very hierarchical organization, the US military, to an enemy that was changing its shape on the ground all the time. And what he found was they needed to create what he calls shared consciousness. And the same is true with these kinds of early warnings. It's not that the data aren't there. The data are always there. It's just they're locked in individual brains. They're spread out somewhere where we're not seeing them. So we're not seeing the strategic implications.
So Frank just asked a follow-up, and this is Rita's sweet spot, so I'll comment, then I'll turn it over to Rita. He's asking if Exxon and BP will have less freedoms the longer they wait to make changes. And the answer to that is absolutely, unequivocally, that is true. So if you think about their business, they pour concrete, they build or lease these massive ships that are as big as small towns. These are assets that have 20, 30, 40-year life cycles. So they're spending capital today that they will be depleting over the next 20 to 30 years. So every decision they make today to influence the future locks them into some kind of economic outcome. Another fascinating area for me, and it's one of the things that I discuss when I'm coaching CEOs and board members, is this kind of asymmetry between a CEO lifespan or board lifespans, compensation, and the future. So if you think about some of these industries, and it's one of my favorite topics, like I'm the CEO of big petroleum company, global petroleum company A, and I'm going to retire in 5 years. How do I think about radical change in my organization? And how do I think about preparing my organization for an event that is certain to happen in 20 or 30 or 40 years? And the certainty is you won't be selling gasoline to automobiles. So your demand will be down very, very significantly. When my compensation is tied to now, in the next 5 years. It's a huge cultural problem. It's a big issue for boards. Even board members can think the same way. I'm on the board. I'm going to be here 3 years. Because all I have to do is not do anything that gets me sued when I leave, and I'll collect my my stock compensation. So the cultural aspect of these kind of transformations and the personal kind of motivations can be very disconnected from a really obvious future state. Rita and I are working with a petrochemical company now, and I'll let Rita tell the story about this engagement, but it's very, very typical of how some organizations operate. Rita, do you want to talk about?
Oh, sure. So toward the end of, it would have been 2020, sort of fall of 2020, I get this frantic call. We really, really, really want to work with you. You've got to come talk to our board. We want to transform. We want to change. We want to do all this. And it was all like, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Let's get the contract in place. Let's get this moving. So then frantic pace of meetings, like, hours of meetings every week, getting ready for this board, lots of research. Here's what we want to do. Meeting with the strategy committee, meeting with the board advisors, meeting. I mean, they were like my whole calendar for about 3 months there. And so the big board meeting happens. Let's say it was January, and we're all ready, right? Like, okay, we got the go ahead, the green light. The board loved it. It was really mind blowing, and they loved the way we talked about their stock price. We loved the way they talked about their future communication strategy. This is all great. And so we're getting into January, and well, there's a lot of work to do to follow up on the board. Okay, so now it gets to be kind of February, and they're kind of looking around and quarter's looking a little soft, and we've got this digital transformation thing that we're also trying to worry about. And I'm like, look, I'm here, let me know. And so there's like 2 guys that I'm working with pretty closely and giving ideas and, doing various activities. But the main attention of the leadership seems to have moved on. So February turns to March turns to April. And then I get this sort of sheepish call saying, well, we're not sure that we can really act on the things that we talked about because there's all this other stuff going on. So we're going to put it on pause. I'm thinking to myself, it's fine with me. Like, it's your company, but all that progress we made, you just know is going to erode, right? So the enthusiasm, the energy, the momentum is going to erode, and then we're going to have to start it up again. And it's going to be back to back-to-back crisis meetings when the next thing happens. And what's going to happen, I suspect, is the board's going to start to ask pretty pointed questions about, you were talking this great game in January. What show us where it is. And this is actually something Ron and I are working on a lot, which is how do we create consistency across the management of a portfolio. And it is one of the perennial frustrations when you go into a large, complicated company and you say to them something very innocuous, like, so what are you guys working on? Once you dig into that question, what becomes pretty clear is nobody knows. And so one of the things we've been building, and I've been doing it manually for years, we're working on this tool to kind of make it a little easier to figure out what's where at what stage, but more importantly, to capture information about it as it's developing. So you don't get this mythology about what actually happened in the company. And you've got some idea about who's working on what and to what end. And it's not to try to impose layers of control. It's just to create a reality around what is it that we've actually learned? What is it we're actually doing? And we're excited about it. I think it could be a bit of a breakthrough. So I'm keen on it. Was that sort of what you had in mind, Ron, for me to talk about?
Yeah, it absolutely was. There's now a question here. It's like, can you apply this framework to product development and early stage entrepreneurship? And I think the answer is absolutely. I'm going to talk about product development, Rita, and I'll let you talk about entrepreneurship. And what I'll talk about in product development is I actually just posted this morning the story of Minidisc and Sony, and
you should probably tell them a little bit about yourself now that I'm thinking.
Because
I don't think I did a very good job introducing you.
Well, thank you, Rita. I grew up at Sony, so I spent probably about half of my career at Sony, in various roles, but ultimately,
you were there when it really grew, right? I mean, you were there.
I was there, yeah. When I joined Sony, it was about $1 billion company. When I left, it was about a $30 billion company, which was a fantastic ride. And still many of my closest friends are still Sony people in the Sony world. So it was a great ride, and I got to do a lot of things that if the company wasn't growing that fast, I probably wouldn't have got to do. And one of them was run the personal mobile products company. So back in the day, that was the Walkman company. And Minidisc was one of the products. And if you go to my LinkedIn, you'll see a little story on Minidisc and kind of what happened there. But the question is, can you apply this framework to product development? So beyond Sony, I then went out into retail. I was at Best Buy during one of their transformations, which is really exciting. And I've also done a lot of work in private equity with a number of transformations in private equity, and some very successful and some not so successful, because that's how the world goes. I want to talk about, from a product development standpoint, there are a couple of really interesting ways to think about this. So when I first got into product on the Sony side, the compact disc was still a really big thing, right? And it was going to be eventually replaced by pure digital audio. And it was very, very clear to the music industry, it was very, very clear to Sony that this was going to happen. But the question becomes, how do you prepare for that? And how do you truly think through that? The Minidisc article touches on some of these things. So those of you who are older than Flaminia, God bless you, Flaminia, probably never owned a CD player, understand
I never did.
the digitization of audio was a terrifying thing for the music industry, because it meant you could now, once it's ones and zeros, it's quite easy to photocopy a CD. So the industry spent a lot of time trying to constrain the free movement of music, while the electronics industry wanted to sell devices that could, copy and replicate music. And it was very, very clear to see that there was a point at which where broadband was going to get fast enough, the internet was going to get fast enough, that truly downloading and streaming music was going to happen. But it wasn't clear as when that point was or what the business model was. Throughout the 90s, there was a huge number of failed attempts to control music. One was called the Secure Digital Music Initiative. If you ever want to have your head explode, go to Wikipedia and read about that one. I lived through that for about 5 years, which essentially was an industry trying to put a digital wrapper around everything in the world. And of course, that never worked. And ultimately, the people who solved this problem were not in the music industry, and were, in fact, not in the portable music device industry. And it was a little fruit company called Apple that came up with this thing called an iPod and Apple Music. And they were able to do it because they, from my perspective, they were free of the constraints of thought and free of the constraints of the conflicts within the music and electronics industry. If you think about Sony, Sony actually owned both pieces. They owned the biggest record company in the world and the biggest electronics company in the world, and we could not talk to each other. I actually proposed a product called Music Station in Japan, which almost got me fired, that said we can combine these things and make digital recordings and sell them. And I proposed that in 1999. And you guys know that the iPod wasn't even introduced until 4 or 5 years later. So we were ahead, but we couldn't execute because we culturally could not get out of our own way. And frankly, the idea was probably a little bit too early. But you absolutely, unequivocally, it was obvious to everyone in the industry that this was coming. What was not obvious was, and was not really well thought out, in my opinion, was all the optionality. And Rita can talk about platforms and stepping stones as something that she's written a lot about, that those platforms and stepping stones were not developed and were not worked. And therefore somebody on the outside just did it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's an amazing story. I remember there was an article that came out, and I want to say it was as long ago as 1984. And it was the title of the article was The Civil War Inside Sony. And the article made the point that, you had the hardware people and they wanted all the content to be free. You had the content people and they wanted the hardware to be free, and then you sort of had the distribution people who didn't care what happened as long as they got their act together and you had something to sell, and nobody talked to each other. So absolutely difficult. So let's talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, because I think, yes, you can definitely apply this model to entrepreneurship with true entrepreneurship. What I mean by that is when you're creating a new category. So I'm not talking about opening up like a franchise dry cleaning business, which is also entrepreneurship. I'm not denigrating it, but I'm saying if you're truly creating a new kind of category. And the case I'll use here is the case of Jim McKelvey, who's been a fireside guest, and he was one of the co-founders of the product that later became Square. And basically it's, making a phone a credit card. And the reason he thought about this product, and it was not his first business, he's actually a glass blower. He's a very highly skilled and highly trained glass blower. And he was in the process of packing up his studio in one part of the country to move it to another. And there was this huge, really ugly piece of glass that he didn't know what to do. He didn't really like it. And he finally found a buyer for it. And he was just thrilled. But it turns out this buyer was a woman who wanted to pay for this thing on her American Express card. And he couldn't accept American Express cards. He was a very small business at the time. And, tiny little businesses can't afford interchange fees. They can't afford the overhead of what it takes to be accredited as a vendor. And Amex is expensive. I mean, for years, many people didn't carry them because they were so expensive to wear. So he lost the sale. And this sparked in him a passion to figure out, why couldn't we make a credit card product that would work for people like him, that would work for small vendors. And he's got a wonderful book called The Innovation Stack, which I can highly recommend to any of you that are interested in innovation. I can also recommend watching our fireside chat, which you'll find on YouTube. He's just tells the story in a wonderful way. But what he talks about is that any existing regime bumps up against a wall. And if you think about it as venturing out into unknown territory, there comes a point where what's known comes to an end. And it comes to an end, I would argue, this is my language, not his, but it comes to an end because there's some breakthrough, there's some barrier, there's some inflection point that has not yet happened. And what these true entrepreneurs do is they really think about, what would it take to break through that? Like, what is the inflection point I would have to create or leverage to break through that? And McKelvey talks about all the things they had to do to turn the phone into a credit card. And there's a whole chapter on how you get regulated as a credit card provider. And then there's the technology, right? Because those of you that know the Square reader, it's a tiny little square that you plug into the part of your phone that used to have the headphones in it, which doesn't anymore. But and I guess now they plug it into wherever the charging thing is. But they had to make this really thin, really attractive looking device. They had to solve all these problems. And so what I think how the model applies in entrepreneurship is you've got your time zero, which is this thing's in everybody's hands. And my brother who does plumbing can accept credit card payments. That's the vision. That's the time zero. But what we have to do is break through all these barriers to do it. And in the book, McKelvey talks about how Amazon literally tried to take them out. They had I think it was called Neighborhood, something like that. I forget what the Amazon reader was, but he said he would go to bed at night like sweating bullets because, my God, one of the best financed, most aggressive, best run companies on the planet is coming after your little startup. And he said, we talked about it, we spoke about it, we went back and forth as a leadership team, trying to figure out what are we going to do. And then we decided to do absolutely nothing differently because we had solved all these problems that Amazon didn't even know existed yet. And eventually, after about, I think it took about a year, but after about a year, Amazon folded. They just said, we can't compete with this startup that's so laser focused on solving this series of problems. And in what I thought was quite a nice gesture to the customers, when Amazon decided to pull out of this business, they bought Square readers for all of their customers. Sent the Square readers in a beautiful little box with a note saying, we think you'll be better serviced by working with Square. And, fascinating story. But again, you've solved these problems in ways that are not copyable by somebody who hasn't had that experience. And so that's how I would relate it to this sort of category creating flavor of entrepreneurship.
So the question here is, what do you think people working for Kodak should have done differently? And this is from Frank as well.
Oh, hey, Frank, we should get you on the screen here. Anyway, Kodak. So I have to tell you a very personal story. So my dad worked at Kodak for many, many years and had a whole group of contemporaries. So my dad is a world-class selenium tellurium organic chemist. That was his passion. And he has over 100 patents to his name. I mean, super brilliant guy. And he belonged to this whole cadre of scientists and people that work together and people that solve these really, really thorny technological problems. And just last weekend, they had a bit of a reunion. And I was invited because part of the agenda was they were going to talk about my dad, who unfortunately passed away early this year, but they were going to tell stories about him and talk about him and sort of share tales. And of course, these are all guys who were in the R&D group at Kodak. And oh, I've got to write this up because the stories they told about the inventions that were in the labs, the breakthroughs that they had made, they invented color copying before it was even a thing, right? They invented breakthroughs around transmission of digital signals that nobody could match. And as they described it, they said, we'd invent this stuff in the labs and we could see how this was going to break through these barriers, how it could create an inflection point where it would go. And we'd go to headquarters and they'd say things like, well, there's no market for that. And they'd go, all right, that's the point. There's no market for it. And headquarters would be like, well, we can't sell something. How do we tell our sales force to sell something into a market that doesn't exist? So it was just this, vision for the future, this kind of entrepreneurial breaking through those barriers, crossing the barren territory and figuring out how to make it go, absolutely meets, Kodak liferdom at headquarters. And they just wouldn't go for it. And there was a great story, Ron, you'll appreciate this one, which they told at the time of, there was the Olympics, which was I guess it must have been in Tokyo. And the Olympic Committee was asking for sponsorship. And what they were looking for was about $4 billion. And Kodak said, no, we've got the big brand, we're not going for it. We'll give you $2 billion. And Fujifilm, which at the time did not have much of a brand name, did not have much of a presence, in ordinary people's imagination, Fujifilm said, we'll give you 3.5 billion. So the Olympic Committee went with Fuji. Of course, this is a global event, right? And Kodak's attitude was, well, fine, we're Kodak, we can live without you. But what that did was it opened the world's eyes to the fact that Fuji even existed. And it created the inroads through which Fuji was able to establish global partnerships and become, in many parts of the world, in the heyday of film, near equal to Kodak in terms of revenue and scope. And then, of course, Fuji was a lot smarter about getting into digital than Kodak was. Kodak was afraid of it.
Yeah.
The Kodak people.
They also developed much more affordable mini labs. So in the early days of mini labs, the Kodak mini lab was say $100,000, and Fuji was 40. So it's really interesting. There's an interesting little question. I think it's a great blog for you, Rita, is like, why did Kodak not become 3M? Why did 3M become this innovation factory, this mining company, when Kodak had these great scientists and they did not? There's some reason for that I think is very interesting.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that like today we tend to lay the blame at economic short-termism and income inequality and stock buybacks, and none of that was there in Kodak's period of glory and its period of decline and fall. So there's a different explanation, and I think it really does come down to a couple of things. The mindset of people running organizations, is often totally inimical to the mindset required to run something that's new. And I think what happened at Kodak was you had a whole thermal layer of managers who just, you have a product with 65% profit margins and you've dominated that for decades, and you get really, really good at what I call the exploit part of the product lifecycle. And what I would argue is we need to build organizations today that are good at the innovation growth, uncharted waters. Let's create the breakthroughs. Let's do that entrepreneurial thing. So that's where new advantages come from. Yes, you've got to have people that are great at running the thing. I mean, that's obvious. That's where you get your returns. But then you've got to have people who are good at that transformation and change thing. Because if you think about innovation is coming in waves, what was innovation becomes exploitation, becomes transformation. And I think the leaders of the future are going to need to get really good at all of that. And that's actually one of the reasons I'm so excited to be working with Ron, because I know a lot about that first part. That's where I've spent my whole life is, unicorns and fairy dust and let's invent the next big thing. I'm a lot less experienced when it comes to, okay, that was great. That thing is now, heading stage left. What do we do with the company at that point? And Ron's had a tremendous amount of experience at that. So it's been really interesting to bounce perspectives off each other as we build this set of offerings.
So there's some questions here from Frank as well. We should have him as a panelist.
I don't think I've ever met Frank.
I really like this fireside concept. Why one demand oriented, focused on questions. Thank you. Driven by great technology such as Zoom, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. Question: can you relate, please? Changes happening, and we're adding Frank.
You can add Frank. Why not? He's a very loyal fireside visitor.
Education to your early learning model. This is a great question, Frank, because Rita talks about this all the time as it relates to Columbia and executive education and everything happening in the digital space. So, hi, Frank. Welcome to the panel.
I put him on the spot. I don't think he knew he was going to get promoted to panelist.
We're lucky he's not sitting in his bathroom or his swimming pool or something.
He did have the right to decline. He didn't have to accept.
Yeah, he did not have to accept. That's true. You can't force him into the panel.
Yeah, so let's talk about education, and I'll talk about something that we've done at Columbia, which I think is pretty forward thinking, and then something I'm working on, just aside from that. So at Columbia, so here we were, February of 2020, and, looking at, I don't know, $19 million worth of business, right? Which we booked basically, because the in-person exec ed market is a really long cycle market. And that just went poof. And so after about 2 weeks of sort of saying, what do we do? I sat down with our dean and I said, look, people are not going to stop needing to learn, and executives are not going to stop needing to be developed. And there's going to be a need there. We've just got to figure out some different way of doing it. So what we pivoted to was what we're calling live online. And so it's this kind of format, actually, very discussion oriented with, the usual cast of professors. And we learned a bunch of things. So one of the things we learned was that there's an absolute hunger for it. Second thing we learned was that that we broadened the population of people that we could serve, that could come and join us, because It didn't matter if you were in Hong Kong or Malaysia or Nigeria or wherever, you could dial in as long as you had an internet connection, which even then was a little dicey for some folks. We had people on the phone, there was a big wind. So we learned we could reach a lot more people. We also learned that we could experiment with different formats. So rather than everybody comes to New York and we hang out for 3 days and it's fire hose. For example, with one of my courses, I extended it over a number of weeks. And so it was less intense during the week, but spread out longer. So you could actually take the concepts and apply them and then come back and talk about what you did and ask questions about what you were learning. So it integrated the learning much more with people's work. And I actually think that model is going to continue even once we're able to have in-person classes again, because I think it meets a different need, that learners have. So let me talk a little bit about what I'm working on. And it's a concept that really is about, so give a little bit of context. So we have a technology we're working on. It's software, but don't think of it as a software offering. It's basically a guide. It's sort of a spine to, let's say, learning something new. And it takes you through a series of checkpoints. And the idea would be that, let's say one of the checkpoints is figuring out customer segmentation. Well, let's say you don't know anything about customer segmentation, or the last time you had it was in your MBA program 15 years ago, and you were still doing 4 Ps for marketing, and you really want to get up to speed on it. Well, the sort of existing approaches would say, oh, go off to Columbia, get on a plane, sit in our classroom, learn what you can, and go back and try to figure it out when you get back home. So my thought, and this is really the whole Valise concept, right, is how do I bring this to the organization so that people can benefit from it where they are? They don't have to go somewhere. And so the idea is you'd be hitting this part of the system, which sort of says, customer segmentation, click here. And it takes you to an inventory of learning resources, some of which are going to be little short videos, maybe recordings of something, some of which are going to be downloadable. Here's a checklist, here's a form, here's a video of Rita actually doing a customer interview. Here's the 5 things to avoid when you're doing a customer interview. So it allows you in, an hour sort of format to get smarter about that. Then you come back and you do the work, and then you kind of iterate backwards and forwards, bring what you need to learn. And then maybe down the road, there'll be like a badging function where I could say, hey, Frank took the module, answered the quiz. He's now a level 5, competent person. And so down the road, when I'm thinking about who do I staff on a venture, or who do I pull together to work on a transformation project, or who I can now see what course they've taken, what skill they've exhibited, what measures they are. And so it gives me that level of, wow, this person I might not have thought about because they weren't in my circle of people. I can now reach out and pull them into this project that I'm working on. I also think that could be great for example, for the diversity agenda, because a lot of times, we have this human natural tendency to connect to the people that we know, but there may be very capable people who we don't know, but who have the skills that we need. And so wouldn't it be cool if we could see that across our organization? So that's what we're working on. And I'm, as you can tell, I'm really excited about it. But it's this idea of learning. And I still think there'll be a role for executive education in it from an education point of view. But I think this idea of learning when you need to, as you need to, in a structured way, I think that's got a very powerful alternative approach.
So what are you thinking about financing? I see this fireside chat is great, but it's free. And how do you make it work? Do you have sponsors, or when learning becomes more integrated, we can easily, how do we work out new financing models in education that work for everyone?
Yeah, so
Frank,
I think
when you accepted the panelists, we billed your Visa card $2,000. So thank you.
Talk about hardball, Ron. Jeez, you're going to freak people out. Now, what we're thinking about doing is, if you think about the funds that are available, let's say for innovation, there'll be some kind of project budget. And right now, if you wanted to buy tools, right? So you wanted to subscribe to Idea Scale, or you wanted to get a piece of software that helps you do, I don't know, whatever. I think there'll be a budget, something like that, right? And my guess is some of it'll come out of the consulting budget. So let's just make this up. So let's say you came to Ron and myself and you said, I've got this program. I want to figure out what haptic technology means for the future of holography. We'd be like, okay. So, I'd really like you guys to work with me on doing that. So what we could do is just say, okay, here's like a consulting fee for that project. We'll set it up in a 6-month period. If you're happy with how it's going, we'll continue. If you're not, we stop. But I think it'll be financed something like that. I think it'll be more of a services model, is my guess. But then there's also going to be a lot of free stuff around it, right? Because part of my role in life is to do research and discover new things. And so I could imagine there'll be a free layer, which anybody can tap into. And then if you want more hands-on, more intensive help, then there'll be a paid layer. Similar to, right, I'd say, the analogy I'll draw is to when I give speeches and stuff, right? Some of it's free. This is not for charge. And some of it's expensive because you're having an event or you're having people or you want your senior leadership team to do it. So I think it'll be something like that.
In relating to that, Marianne had a question about entrepreneurial growth in innovation in the area of professional services, which I think is related to kind of where Frank's going, because obviously what we do is professional service. I can start on this, Rita, and give you my views. And but I think what's happened with the pandemic has really been a massive opportunity for innovation in professional services. So there's a group that I've been associated with called the Chameleon Collective, for example, and they were a virtual and still are a virtual marketing company. And they don't have an office anywhere in the world. They have, I think, over 200 employees now. In their business, I can't give you the numbers because they're a private company, but their business exploded during the pandemic because things like Zoom and digital conferences and companies figuring out that, and Rita and I are associated with another services company that has figured out that their clients has figured out that you don't have to fly somebody to their office every week to have them do coding. They can actually do coding from anywhere on the planet. So their costs have dropped dramatically, their business is up, and their profit is way up. And the people using these digital tools, and frankly, the cultural adaptation of the tools, right? So I don't have to be sitting. My daughter is going to work for a major global bank this summer. She graduated from Villanova University. Thank you very much. Magna cum laude. Thank you very much. And yeah, she did very well. She's never met anyone at the bank. She did her internship last summer virtual. She did all her interviews this year virtual. She starts, I think, next week virtual. She may not even meet a person at the bank until January of next year. So the world has changed, and how if you think about a Japanese bank thinking, well, I don't have to meet you to hire you, having grown up at a Japanese company, I can tell you that's amazing, right? So the world in services is changing, Marianne, quite dramatically. And Rita, I don't know if you want to add to that, or Frank, you can add to that too.
Yeah, I'll chime in, and Frank may have a perspective as well. I mean, the fact that Flaminia is here is a great gift of the pandemic to me. I mean, I'm always traveling in the pre times. I would always be traveling. I would be in my New York office, once every couple of weeks. I'd be on site, teaching or working with clients. And so I could never have an intern because for many years, the presumption of sponsoring an intern was you'd be there and they'd be with you and they'd watch what you did and they got to sit in on meetings and all that stuff. And so Flaminia's sister, actually, who happened to be studying with someone who I guess is a fan of mine, just wrote to me out of the blue and said, would I have an internship? And I wrote her back and I said, look, you look terrifically well qualified. I'd love to, but understand I don't have an office and I don't have any of the normal things interns expect. And she said, oh, that's all right. I'll be spending the summer in Italy. I was like, done. And then Flaminia is her sister. And so the two of them worked over the summer. And Flaminia has now joined us full time, but we've never met in person. We've met Zoom like. But, that kind of unlocking of talent, if you think about it, that's unprecedented. The fact that you can make these connections and leverage those resources. And, clearly I'm not watching over her shoulder with a stopwatch, wondering what she's doing because, one of us is asleep during at least part of the other's working hours. So it just doesn't. It's a whole new model for how we do things.
So, Rita, we have about 9 minutes.
Okay.
So I'll encourage anybody else in the chat, if you have any follow-on questions, please drop them in there. We can post our contact info again. I guess I'll put it in the chat so people can grab it in case they want to reach out after this. So
Ron, a couple of things I do want to talk about a little bit on this theme of time zero. because we've been talking to a lot of smart people about what comes next. And we may be past the pandemic, but let's remember people have been at home, out of the company of other human beings in many, many cases for a long time. Now we're going to go out, no masks, in contact with everybody and their germs in a joyous celebration of life. But the flu has not gone away. Other infectious diseases have not gone away. The cold season, which was very mild this past year, has not gone away. And so even if it's not coronavirus, I think we can anticipate that there are going to be, serious health issues that become apparent once we're all back to socializing and being in person. And and masks have become sort of, in some places, really socially unacceptable. You're treated as weird if you wear one. Not in parts of the world, but in parts of the world you really are. And I'm actually thinking, it has been so nice not to have my annual kind of 3 days in bed with the flu kind of experience that I have every year. Because, when you travel a lot and you're on airplanes a lot and you're in airports a lot, you're going to get something. It's just a matter of time. And so, maybe there's a population like that that's going to take more precautions as we go forward. So I'll be interested to see how that plays out.
I'm thinking, how I've talked to so many people that really liked working at home, mm-hmm. and they found they could do more focused, concentrated work, and they would not get disturbed, and they could make their family life also work better. So I'm thinking, how many offices do we need? Are we going back to this offices, open offices, or what are we doing?
Well, that's the big question. And I have seen every variety of hypothesis that I can imagine on that. So we're seeing some CEOs, Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, the people at Goldman Sachs, basically saying, absolutely not. We're done with this work at home thing. We need everybody in the office. And we're also seeing a whole backlash. There were several articles in both the Wall Street Journal and the Times talking about how, for a lot of people, they're like, no. And there was a great profile of a young woman who was told, had to be in the office, really important meeting. So gets up early, drops her child at daycare, does the hair, the makeup, the whole thing, puts on the business suit, drives to the office for a meeting that lasted exactly 6 minutes. Wow. And she said, that was it. That was it. I handed in my papers that afternoon. I found another job that would do remote, and I'm gone. I'm out of there. So I think this unrealistic expectation, this expectation that is born from a time when you had a very different way of managing people, is going to be really different. And people that grew up digital, as a younger friend of mine said to me, look, I can understand why the partners want to be in the office. It's because they're in meetings all day long, and where they want to be able to schmooze with the client and go and have lunch down the hall and, everything. I said, the rest of us, we're putting together PowerPoint decks all day long. I sit in the office with my headphones on. Why do I need to be there? I can do PowerPoint decks here just as easily as I can do it there. So there's this fascinating kind of tension about what is work and what is creative work. I do think there's something about human contact, and Ron, I'd love you to weigh in on this because you've experimented with all kinds of flavors of this, this ability to build trust and to really be together sort of in the trenches. And when you're there all night, you get the deliverable just over the finish line right before the deadline. And there's something exhilarating and very human about that. I don't know if that can be replicated virtually. Maybe it can. I do know that it's important to build trusting relationships for certain kinds of really complex problem solving.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think what's going to happen truly, and it's interesting that the people playing the most brass knuckle kind of tactics are in the financial services industry. Shocking, right? So I think the answer is going to be yes. It's going to be both. So I think about some of the events. If I go way back when we were doing our transformation and turnaround at Brookstone, one of the things that we found out was that the website provider that we had was, you want to talk about time zero, basically on July 1 was going to close the doors. And we found this out in January-ish. And so we had to, buy ATG and code a very complex, very large website in a matter of 3 or 4 months. And it turned into a 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week kind of thing where, I, as a CEO, would, show up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a stack of pizzas And I think it was transformational for the company on a number of in a number of ways. But nobody wants to live like that. I mean, those people literally had to have a month off after that to just find their families and be human again. And I think that's kind of what one of my sons went to work for one of the largest global banks right out of Boston College. And I said, if you take the job, you have to take it for 2 years, and you know you're in the worst industry with the worst company. So don't come to me and tell me you want to quit in 6 months. And 6 months into it, he said, this is the most miserable place I've ever worked in my life. We made him stay 2 years. He kept his commitment. Now he's started his own business, and he's very successful. And he and a bunch of his friends started a business in July of last year. They don't have an office. They don't meet their clients in person. It's all on Zoom. They're starting now to go out and be in the physical world. But I think it's going to be both. I think it's an and. Because you do need, we are the creatures that pick the shiny pebble from the stream. We're very tribal. We're very tactile. But we also want to be in our cave once in a while and be left alone. And I think it's going to be both.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing to navigate is going to be this hybrid, right? And it's like, I mean, we've experimented with this already with teaching. Like, I can optimize teaching for screen. There's ways we can get people engaged and have conversations and be invested in each other. And I can optimize teaching in the classroom. I mean, that's easy. I've done that all my life. It is impossible to get a really fulfilling experience if you're trying to do both. And a lot of universities are doing this, where they'll have like 25% of the students in the class because the students want it. Right. They want to be with each other. That's what they want. The professor's just kind of, the proximate cause for us being in this room together, but we want to be in the room together. And so I think, we're learning a lot of interesting things about what works and what doesn't. This is great. So Ron, folks that want to know more, get to know us, where, our emails are in the chat. If you want to know more about what we're doing, if you want to understand more about what we're building at Valise, I'll talk to anybody who will listen to me. Because it's been a long time. I mean, I've been working on this now for 5 years and have not found the formula yet. So we're working on it. But, it's coming along. And I think there's some really nice tools that are being built that I think could be really helpful. And we're trying to make it, back to your question, Frank, about economics, we're trying to make it accessible, at one end, and then, more bespoke for those that need or want a more intensive level of help. And I think that's what we're working on now.
Yeah. And so the whole purpose of Belize is to take Rita's brilliant concepts that from end to competitive advantage, discovery-driven growth, seeing around corners, and use some of my experience and other people's experience as well to bring them out and solve real problems for real people in the real world. And we're doing some of that, and it's a lot of fun. So if you want to talk more about that, our contact info is in there. We're out there on the web. It'd be hard not to find Rita. She's like, it's not a blind squirrel and acorn thing. She's everywhere. So you can find her on the internet if you need her, and we'd be happy to help you if you need our help.
That's great. Hey, this is terrific. Alignment of culture in hybrid work in organizations. So Bogdan, I'll answer that one quickly, and then I think we need to respect people's time and let folks get back to their day. This has been fun, though. We should do these more often.
We should do this every once in a while. This is great.
Yeah,
so we can have guest hosts like Frank. Come on.
Totally. Now that we know him, so we'll get to know you virtually, Frank, and we'll build up trust, and then you can be part of the happy tribe. So Bogdan, I'd like to go back to some work that was done at MIT by a guy named David Allen. And he was interested in studying the research productivity of researchers. And the thing he was interested in was how much information gets shared by these people. And one of his independent variables was how far away from one another were they sitting. Interesting. It shows you what professors get up to, right? But what he found was this super interesting graph. So if you imagine the vertical dimension is information richness. So how much information got shared and processed and used, and how much do they bounce ideas off each other? And the horizontal dimension was how far apart they were sitting from each other, physically sitting at work. And he found a line that kind of went like this, like this, like this, very rich, very rich, very rich, and then fell off a cliff. And what he concluded was that by the time you have a group that is literally sitting more than 60 feet, about 20 meters apart, the flow of information just comes to a choke point. And so the conclusion from that study, and that was done years ago, is if you're sitting more than 60 feet from another person, you have to be much more intentional about the communications. So, Ogden, to come to your question, I think you need to work on it. And it takes, like, culture kind of happens if you're hanging around the office. I mean, one of our clients said it to us that she's working on an innovation program. And she said, we're all sitting together, so we all knew what was going on. Now every day's a meeting, right? And so when you're together, there's just this natural flow. But when you're farther apart, you have to be much more intentional. So you have to structure things like, let's have a cultural conversation. You have to structure things like, for today, we're going to go around the room and we're going to talk about early warnings. We're going to talk about, how do we handle it when one member of the team can't be part of a call that's scheduled for whatever reason? Do we record it and then they catch up later? Do we say, no, we have all got to be, and how are we going to do this? And I think you have to be much more explicit and intentional if you're building a hybrid culture. I'll leave you with a great example that you should look up. So there's a company called Buffer, which is one of my all-time favorite startup stories. And Buffer started virtual, went to sort of in person, found that cut them off from a lot of would-be talent and created all kinds of problems. So then they went hybrid, and then they abandoned hybrid. They said, it's just too difficult. Like, we can optimize for virtual, that works great. We can optimize for in person, that works great. The hybrid thing is it's just causing so much extra work. It's just not worth it. And I thought that was interesting. So they have a very active blog. Their CEO is a great guy and is very open about the decisions he makes as a manager. So the company's Buffer, look them up. I think you'll find them really interesting. Well, so thank you, everybody. This has really been fun. Thank you, Ron, for jumping in at the last minute. And Flaminia, enjoy your birthday and have a great time in Tuscany. And we'll see you all next week. Next week's fireside is David Duncan from Innosight's going to talk about why customers should not be a mystery. So thanks, Ron.
Thanks, everybody. This was great.